would have. Some other plans. There we go. No, it went too far. I'll do that one second. There you go. All right, so our meeting agenda today, we'll do some introductions, watershed planning history, the purpose of our meeting, watershed plan, purpose and need, the initial NEPA concerns identified during previous scoping activities and meetings. Alternatives are still preliminary, final to be analyzed in detail with a final design and things if it proceeds that far. And opportunity to identify any other NEPA concerns. The National Environmental Protection Act is NEPA. Introductions. We have some folks in the room with us today, even though the meeting's virtual, but it's virtual and live, so we got a dual purpose here. The first introductions we'll do is the watershed plan local sponsor, which is the Cass County Joint Water Resource District. Roger Olson is the current chair. Ken Lougheed is a member. Jake Gust, Keith Weston, and Rick Steen. We have 4 of those 5 with us here in attendance. Just a note, they are the actual watershed plan sponsor and have the jurisdiction over what plan gets approved, even though there's been collaboration with Barnes County Water Resource District and the Steele County Water Resource District during the planning process. More engineering, we're the consultants that the board has chosen us to proceed and put together this plan with all of the consultation from landowners and project team members and others. Pat Downs, that's myself. I'm the project coordinator. Josh Hassel is with us today. He's the project engineer. Kurt Lisney is a gentleman up in my left over here in the front of the room. He's the senior project manager engineer for Maple River and Cass County Joint Water Resource Districts both. Megan Dietrich was an environmental scientist on our team. We did have sub-consultants of Rooney and Associates, did some initial economics and the final economics, I guess, to this point. And Bar Engineering did some geotech and other environmental elements of the plan. This planning began at the end of 2015, so it's been quite a journey to this point. NRCS, they're the lead federal sponsor team. Nathan Jones is now the acting North Dakota State Conservationist. Christy Fisher is the state conservation engineer for North Dakota. Other members of her team are Rita Sveen, a watershed planner, John Peterson, hydraulic engineer, Tom Shanador, a design engineer. We have Richard Webb, the state resource conservationist, Kurt Bradbury, a state biologist, Janelle Harrison, cultural resource specialist, Paul DeBoer is an acting East Zone assistant for field operations, Bobby Ostrom from Maple River CDU's supervisor, and Josh Munchin, who is part of our Munson, let me say that correctly, Cass County District Conservationist, and he was one of our project team members and attended all of the meetings. So now we'll pass the baton to NRCS, and they'll take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. You guys hear me okay there in the room?
Yeah, it's a little quiet, but you know, turn
Turn up a little bit.
a lot.
I can hear, but.
Testing.
We can hear you, Christy. We're trying to get you a little louder.
Okay. All right, I'm saying hello here, and I'm going to turn my video off just because that interrupts the broadcast sometimes. Our internet here is not the best at the USDA office in Bismarck, unfortunately, these days. So you'll notice today we're going, can I go ahead and start, or are we still working on technology?
Go ahead.
Okay, so you'll notice today, and apologies for everyone who's been involved in these meetings for the last 7 years, that we're going to rehash a bunch of things. And unfortunately, that's sort of a requirement for this meeting. We're really redoing the initial meeting that we had on this planning effort that was started in 2016. And we're redoing this because we've determined recently here that just this year that we needed to go through the full EIS route, an environmental impact statement, rather than an environmental assessment. So as a result, the meeting that we had back in 2016 to start off this project, it wasn't advertised in the Federal Register so that folks across the nation, individuals or organizations could provide input, and that's a requirement of the EIS. So apologies to everybody there. We're going to have to rehash a bunch of things because folks from outside the area, either on live today or that may log on and watch this recording in the next 60 days, need to understand sort of the big picture and how we got to where we got to. So really how we got to where we got to in terms of starting this plan was the Red River Retention Authority back in 2014 applied for NRCS funding at a national level. So that went to our national headquarters to use Regional Conservation Partnership Program funds to do PL 566 watershed plans in the basin. So that was approved and included both Minnesota and the North Dakota sides of the basin, as well as South Dakota. The goals for that project: damage reduction and retention, water quality improvement, and wildlife habitat improvement. So any PL 566 plans that met any one of those goals was then eligible to apply. The Red River Retention Authority ended up selecting 20 projects that are shown here on the map, and the Upper Maple River watershed was watershed number 15 on the map, was one of those 20 plans. So moving forward, NRCS and the Castrant Water Resource District signed an agreement for the planning work. That interagency team, as well as tribes, were contacted to provide input, and we started things off with a scoping meeting in 2016. Could you go ahead and advance the slide? Great. So here is a listing of the agencies that were contacted, as well as advertisements were put into the Cass County Recorder and on the Water Resource District website. So that's how we had advertised the initial meeting. This is the watershed that was determined right from the beginning to represent the planning watershed, and that hasn't changed over the 7-year time period. This was still the watershed that the current EIS would be written for. So go ahead. So yeah, as I noted, that first scoping meeting was back in January of 2016. Can we back up a slide? It's always a pain when you're not advancing the slides yourself. But so a lot of work happened in 2016. Initial work on hydrologic and hydraulic models to represent this entire watershed were done. An initial purpose and need was identified by the planning team, which at that time was pretty focused on retention and flood damage reduction. And sort of it would be nice to also have some wildlife habitat and water quality benefits as well if we could, but the focus really was on flood damage reduction. There were 5 different meetings in that 2016 time period, and in that time period, alternatives were identified and they started to be evaluated, and we'll go through some of those as we proceed here. There were 3 meetings with potentially impacted landowners for the alternatives that were under evaluation. Some further considerations, and really the big group of alternatives were winnowed down to two sites, 2A and 5 were what they were called, and some further work occurred in terms of geologic investigations and geotechnical analysis to determine that the sites were feasible. We then spent the next 3 years of this planning effort on economic analysis, wetland delineation, cultural resources evaluations, on-site work for both of those things. And then after which we had additional public meetings, including some that most recently occurred in 2021. And at that point, the focus really shifted to really saying water quality and wildlife habitat benefits were probably just as important as flood damage reduction. So it really turned into sort of making those goals equal as things proceeded. Go ahead and advance. So why are we having this meeting today, and why did we decide that we need to do a environmental impact statement? This chart here at the right sort of explains the National Environmental Policy Act. You have a proposed action, and through the planning process, you evaluate whether it will have a significant impact or not. If it has no impact at all, there's some categorical exclusions. Those typically aren't used for a big watershed project through our PL 566 program. More typically, if we're unsure of whether it would have a significant impact, we go through an environmental assessment process, and that's where we thought we'd be going with this project. But we had another project up on the north branch of the Park River, very similar to this project, a dry dam that was intended to address water quality and wildlife habitat benefits, as well as flood damage reduction. And our national headquarters came back in late 2022 and told us that no, that needed to be, because there's a potentially a beneficial impact that's significant, that we needed to do an EIS. So therefore, all of any retention project in the Red River that would have a beneficial impact on water quality would need to go through EIS. So that's the purpose of our meeting today, is to go through that. And frankly, we can do a better job potentially in getting scoping comments from the public and other agencies, because now we know what alternative has sort of risen to the top. And so we'll spend some time today talking through that alternative. But this will be really, we're at the first stage, is this notice of intent and scoping. We'll be moving on probably next fall to the releasing the draft EIS and then soliciting formal comments on that. And when we do that, we'll have an in-person meeting. So the first watershed need was flood damage reductions. This map on the right shows inundated lands from a 25-year flood in the southeast corner of the watershed. And as folks out there know, those are substantial. At the 25-year, there's almost 20,000 acres that are inundated. And has operational impacts. If you run the statistics and you average out by year, the economist that did the analysis for this project found that an average annual damages of $2.1 million just on cropland impacts in the watershed. So that was acknowledged as a watershed need. Go ahead.
I hit it.
Likewise, this map at the right shows all of the sort of historic, just over 3 years road damages that occur in the watershed due to flooding. Those amount to, in an average year, $500,000 of damages, with another almost 200,000 a year damages to legal drains, road ditches, and structures. Within the floodplain, it's largely, when we talk about structures, it's largely grain bins and other agricultural outbuildings. But yeah, just in terms of flood damage reductions, those were considered as well. Go ahead. Another need was water quality, and that's specifically a nutrient reduction. Back in 1909, the United States and Canada signed a treaty called the Boundary Waters Treaty that identified, in Article 4 of the treaty basically agreed that neither country would pollute through waters that are discharging to the other country to the injury of the other. And obviously, despite best intents of both countries, we are both cause pollution problems in the neighboring country. I know there's entities in the United States where there are economic concerns, as well as endangered species concerns, and others with waterways coming across our border from Canada with pollution, and vice versa. In this case, the Red River discharges to Lake Winnipeg, and there is a significant both economic and environmental concern in Lake Winnipeg due to eutrophication, and that's largely driven by phosphorus and nitrogen export into the watershed. And if you look at the Red River itself, obviously there's multiple rivers that come into Lake Winnipeg, but the Red River is a significant contributor. And if you look at phosphorus, we are in an increasing trend. The plot below shows just in 2022, an agreement was made through the International Joint Commission, which is sort of arbitrates this treaty between the United States and Canada. And the agreement was a 0.15 milligrams per liter objective at the international border crossing. This is voluntary at this point. There's no enforcement, but obviously we want to, as a country, show that we're making investments and we're trying to achieve these objectives, so that in negotiations with Canada and other river systems that are impacting us, we can expect the same. So that red dashed line down below is the objective, and as you see, we rarely meet that, and we're not increasing trends. So a project to reduce phosphorus in particular is of value in this watershed. Go ahead and advance the slide. Through all that work between the countries to model and evaluate, where is this nutrient pollution coming from? They sort of rated watersheds in the Red River Basin as to which was the major contributor. The Upper Maple River watershed that's shown there, it's in the second highest category of total phosphorus export. So it's not the highest, but it's the next tier down. So it would be of value to address phosphorus in this watershed. On average, about 30,000 tons of phosphorus are generated from the Upper Maple in an average year. And it's not necessarily, the issue is not necessarily caused from poor farming practices or over fertilization, anything like that. This dissolved phosphorus transport is typical of cold climate, flat agricultural landscapes with fine grained soils, where you have really long time periods of contact during flooding between vegetation, soils, and water. And we're sitting here at river slopes between the Upper Maple and the Red River. We're ranging from 1 to 4 feet of drop in a mile. So you can envision we have this very long contact time for water, soil, and plants to interact. And with the same struggles occur with managing dissolved phosphorus in Finland, in Sweden, in Denmark, other folks with these same type of watershed characteristics. So it's a tough problem to solve. We have lots of great tools. NRCS obviously works with farmers one-on-one to do nutrient management, to put in filter strips, other tools, but those typically handle phosphorus that's bound to sediment and bound to particles. We have a very hard time controlling phosphorus that's moving and dissolved. So projects that reduce flooding on cropland and flooding overall tend to decrease dissolved phosphorus, and we have other tools as well. Okay. And then we are within the prairie pothole region, and it's well known the sort of habitat losses in this region. It's been a priority for our agency and others for many years to restore wetlands in particular, as well as adjacent upland habitat. And there are limited opportunities for wetland habitat in the Red River Basin, but anything we could do on a project that would improve wildlife habitat, particularly by restoring and protecting wetlands, is a priority. Okay. So this is currently the watershed plan purpose statement. And so when alternatives are evaluated and this project is evaluated for its value, this is what we're trying to achieve. So it's primarily a watershed protection project to reduce nutrient loads from the watershed, particularly dissolved phosphorus, and then to increase the quantity and quality of wetlands and wildlife habitat. And it will also result in flood damage reduction to cropland structures, roads, drain ditches, and vehicles stored in the watershed. And if you read through the future EIS, we have draft versions of it sort of in progress right now, as well as all of the economic and the environmental reports that are being prepared for the project. This is what you'll see them address. Okay. So we'll proceed to talk about both the alternative evaluation and the alternative that sort of floated to the top in terms of those three things now at this point.
Thanks, Christy. I'll take over at this point. Again, my name is Josh Assel, more engineering, the project engineer involved with this project from the beginning. So after the project team met and established their draft of the purpose and need statement, we began to evaluate alternatives using H&H modeling, as Christy had mentioned previously, and to come up with a preliminary screening of alternatives that the project team could evaluate for benefits, both from a mainly with a flood perspective, flood protection benefits the downstream. Inherently, Christy also mentioned that with flood protection projects, we are reducing the duration of flood events as it exists on the cropland, and therefore reducing that contact time of the water to the cropland. Therefore reducing the nutrient loading potentially that's moving downstream. Ultimately, I've got a map here. The project team evaluated 38 alternatives that varied from impoundments and dams, levees, channels, wetland, both creation and restoration, cropland conversion from cropland to grass or forest, groundwater, tile management, and others that are detailed in the plan. Ultimately, after evaluating those alternatives, the project team did narrow down the alternatives to 2 preferred alternatives, which are shown in this map just south and southeast of Pillsbury, North Dakota. The 2 alternatives are alternative 5, which is the red on the map there, and alternative 2A, which is the yellow. Both these alternatives are flood water retention dams, dry dams, and ultimately they were selected to be moved forward. After further review and analysis, alternative 5 was removed due to the high construction costs, leaving alternative 2A as the remaining alternative identified for detailed analysis in the EIS. Some details on alternative 2A, and I'll walk through these in a little bit more detail on some of these continuing slides. But we do have a map that shows the various features of the project. As I noted, this is a dry impoundment. The intent is to not retain any water permanently other than that which is necessary for the wetland creation restoration or the biomass harvesting areas, which we'll get into detail here. The impoundment has a drainage area, a contributing drainage area of 59.7 square miles, with the proposed top of the impoundment at an elevation of 1251. The features specifically are primary spillway, which is a 48-inch concrete pipe at an elevation of 1217.7. So the dam is approximately 34 feet in height total at the deepest point. In addition to that 48-inch concrete pipe, we have a 2-way riser that's associated with that. So that way, if the primary pipe gets clogged with debris, there's a trash rack, it can still use the primary spillway through that 2-way cover riser. We have a secondary spillway, which is identified on this map by that tan line on the bottom. And that is a series of concrete straight drop spillways. There's 2 of them, and quite a bit of channel excavation to maintain that spillway and get that water back to the natural channel. And then in addition to that, there's a township road that does run through the middle of this area. And we do propose at this point to have a road raise, a grade raise to allow traffic to continue to use that township road while the dam is not in use or not inundating that roadway. Environmental enhancements, we got these on the map as well. So biomass harvesting areas, those are shaded yellow on the map. And then we have wetland creation and restoration. Those are the blue hatched areas in the map. And then green hatched areas for creation. The blue is restoration. And then we also have in the plan controlled flash grazing, which is a useful tool to help maintain wildlife management. So a little bit more detail on the specific pieces here that we talked about. So this impoundment, this is an example or a typical cross section for the impoundment, which is the green area on that map. Runs from the west to the east, crosses the tributary, and then runs straight north on the west side of that section line. The top of dam, as I noted before, is at 1251. This graphic does include about 3/10 for settlement, so you'll see a little bit different elevation on here. That's an 8-foot top with 3-to-1 side slopes on both sides of the dam. And this typical section may change during final design due to additional geotechnical investigation or potential modifications to that roadways. In addition to the main embankment, we have 2 farmstead levees that will be included as part of the project, which are highlighted in purple on the map, and the red arrows call those out. The intent of the farmstead levee is while the dam is in operation, it will back water up. The intent of these farmstead levees is to keep the water away from those farmsteads and keep those protected up to the top of the dam. And so the levees have a 10-foot top with 3-to-1 side slopes. That north levee has a max height of approximately 7 feet, which is in the southeast corner of that levee. And then the southern levee there has a max height of approximately 3 feet, which is in the ditch adjacent to Highway 32. Some more detail on the primary spillway. I mentioned, so from left to right here is from northwest to southeast. The water is flowing from left to right. So we've got initial trash rack here to keep debris from plugging that 48-inch concrete pipe. We have that 2-way covered riser there to allow, if that trash rack does get clogged with debris, to allow flow to continue to pass through the primary spillway. One of the unique features of this primary spillway, after that is called out in the blue there, is a sump along the primary spillway that'll have pumps installed to supply water to the biomass harvesting areas. And then continuing through the embankment, we've got that 48-inch concrete pipe. And on the right side of the graphic there is our concrete outlet structure for energy dissipation. The water will be moving at a high velocity through that pipe. And so we've got that energy dissipator there to reduce velocities and prevent erosion downstream of the embankment. The secondary spillway that I discussed, so this is a graphic that shows the profile of the secondary spillway. It is that tan area on the south side of the map there. Ultimately, it wraps around the embankment to allow that water to flow as the pool fills. It'll flow west and then back south and then get into that secondary spillway there. They are controlled by 2 straight drop concrete spillways, and both those spillways are called out in that green with the green arrows there. The channel slope between those 2, I believe, is 0.06%, and then from the second spillway to the downstream natural channels of 0.05%. And ultimately, the intent here is with that excavation, we would use that excavation from the spillway to create the dam embankment. So the frequency of use, and so ultimately this dam is intended to be a dry dam, which means that the water that's coming along that natural channel will continue to make its way through the dam until the flow exceeds the capacity of that 48-inch pipe. And so what we've got here is a graphic that shows the inundated area for the various rainfall events, frequency events behind the dam. We've got mapped the 2-year all the way up to the 100-year. And so just to walk you through it quickly here, the 2-year 24-hour is reflected by the yellow shading on the map. Ultimately, that represents just shy of or just over a 2¼ inch rainfall event. That will back water up behind the dam to an elevation of about 1234.7, so about 17 feet, sorry, from the invert to the spillway, the primary spillway. And ultimately, during that event, we'll utilize 540 acre feet approximately of storage volume. And then that will occupy about 134 acres of area behind the dam. I'll just kind of highlight the 100-year since that's the largest event on here. The 100-year 24-hour event, which is just shy of a 6-inch rain, will peak out at an elevation of 1246.1. occupy about 4,400 acre feet of storage behind the dam and inundate the area of about 690 acres behind the dam. And that's reflective of the purple shading on the map there. We do have mapped the other events in between. I won't go through all of them in detail. The one unique piece that I do want to point out is you see some larger areas of shading here, and those are reflective of some of the biomass harvesting areas that will be created. Those areas will also be able to be utilized as storage while the dam is in operation.
Question.
Yeah.
Are you wanting questions at the end of the presentation?
Yeah, we can take them at the end and then
Okay.
we can go back.
Very good.
So what we've got here is a stage hydrograph. So as that dam operates, it will back water up behind the dam. And so on the left-hand side, the vertical part of this graph is elevation in feet. On the horizontal portion of this graph is time in days, starting from an arbitrary date of July 1st. So similar to the previous map, these colors are coordinated. So the 2 years still the yellow, the purple is still the 100-year. And ultimately what this is showing is as that dam is functioning, how long will it maintain a water surface elevation behind the dam. So you can see here from that yellow, which is the bottom line, that will back water up behind the dam on a 2-year, 24-hour event. And water will stay behind the dam for approximately 5 to 6 days. On the 100-year event, the purple line, again reflective, that will back water up behind the dam for a duration about 10 to 12 days, plus or minus. So just to give you some idea on how long will that water be behind the dam as it's operating. And the only other piece to mention here is that assumes that there's no additional rainfall beyond that. So if you do start to get stacked events, those durations would start to lengthen out. So I've talked a lot about mentioned the biomass harvesting areas a couple times already. We'll talk a little bit about that in detail here. And so the biomass harvesting areas are the hatched yellow areas on the map. And I noted during the principal spillway discussion that there will be a sump and pumps that will installed in the principal spillway to divert water through pipelines to feed these areas and maintain water surface elevations throughout the growing season. The south biomass harvesting area has inner berms to allow for a full inundation and full utilization of that area. Ultimately, it is terraced. And then we've got drain tile used to help dewater the site to allow harvesting of the biomass.
So when you refer to biomass, I'm sorry, what are you referring to?
We're talking about hay, right?
Cattails,
Oh,
That's what we're talking about.
it's vegetation that could be, vegetation that has a high uptake in nutrients that could then be removed and ultimately taken out of the flood.
Are you planting it or are you just letting it go native?
We'll probably talk about that here in the next couple slides.
That was my question too. It sounds like hay to me, right?
Cattails.
Then, cattails, they will grow eventually, but, ultimately at this point, we've got a minimum of 240 acres, which is 4 acres per square mile drainage area between the 3 sites. And as I noted, the one is terrace, which is the southern one. The other 2 are flat, but graded to drain. The graphic there shows that we will be creating a berm to maintain that water level and then ultimately flattening off areas to make sure that we're able to maintain an area that can be harvested at a point in the future. This next graphic kind of talks a little bit more detail about that southern one because it is a little bit more unique. So as I noted, this one is terraced. So the graphic goes from west to east. And ultimately, we will have water that's pumped into the cell one, which is the farthest left, the highest one in elevation. And as that reaches the appropriate elevation of 1 to 3 feet of water, it will spill over through control structures into cell 2, which is that middle one. And as cell 2 fills to the appropriate elevation, it will then spill over into cell 3, which is the furthest east and the lowest one in elevation. Ultimately, those control structures, the graphic is shown there as an agri-drain type structure, something that has control to allow us to vary that elevation and ultimately allow us to drain those down in the fall before frost. which will able to be, and ultimately will allow us to provide additional storage, as I mentioned before, to allow those areas to be flooded during spring or any other rainfall events. Oh, sorry, before I move on, sorry, one more thing. So we do have on the bottom of this graphic, you can see, or through that main profile underneath all of those cells, we do have the drain tile called out as well, which will allow that subsoil to be drained as well to allow that access for the biomass harvesting equipment. So a lot of this slide has partially been covered here through discussion, but we'll go through it again quickly. So these biomass harvesting areas are shallow retention basins with a goal of allowing biomass to grow by maintaining a depth of 1 to 3 feet over the growing season. Prior to first frost, before the phosphorus migrates down the soil, the intent is to drain those cells and then cut, bale, and remove that biomass that biomass from the floodplain. And then as part of the ongoing operation, the goal will be to monitor the phosphorus levels in the soil to determine the harvest frequency. And right now, at this point, we've estimated that 2 out of every 3 years will require harvest. With that, I will turn it over to, yeah, go ahead.
So you're saying that if you harvest that 2 out of 3 years, you're gonna significantly reduce that nutrient?
That's, yep, and
Or is that
ultimately
the idea?
that's the idea, yep. And John will talk about here the next pieces of that water quality, that improvement to
Oh,
water
hi,
quality.
John.
Hello. Good timing, good question. You can extend to the next slide, and I'm going to turn off my video too. It's not as sketchy. All right, so what are the calculations that we use for the water quality improvements? What we started with was 2 USGS gauges that measured both continuous flow and water quality parameters. That was the Maple River at Enderlin, so that's downstream of our site, and then the Maple River near Hope, so it's upstream of our site. What we did with those 2 gauges is we looked at the flows that they're having and the phosphorus and nitrogen and suspended solids, but I'm just going to mostly say phosphorus, but it's done for all of them. And then we took those concentrations by the flows and we came up with this plot that you can see here, and that's relating discharge to total phosphorus, and then that's pounds per day. We also looked at numerous other gauges in the area, TMDLs, and a USGS report to make sure that these were all kind of validated each other, and they're very similar curves for each of the different parameters. And you can see that as flow goes up, total phosphorus per day goes up, which makes sense. Again, we did that at the 2 sites, the Enderlin and the Hope, and then to figure out at our site, which is in the middle of that drainage area, we had to scale them, and so we used the PTM app, and that's a water quality model to do the scaling. And you can see kind of at the bottom what we have for the first gauge and then the second gauge, and that would be like annual yield of phosphorus per square mile. And then when you scale up one, they scale down the other, they actually are pretty similar, and you get the average annual load. What we're seeing in terms of phosphorus is about 18,000 pounds per year. And then what we did was we looked at the North Ottawa site. It's a research site with very similar type of kind of layout, and also kind of operated for water quality improvements. And they were seeing the different reductions, 66% for phosphorus, 73% for nitrogen, and 42% for suspended solids. And when you look at the incoming annual sediment, that's the average, and then you reduce it by those percentages, you have what's been retained in the site, and then ultimately harvested, and then what's continuing on downstream. So that's a little bit of the details in terms of the numbers that we're showing in terms of projected reductions on average. Go to the next slide. So beyond just the water quality improvements, I did want to talk about some of the wetland improvements. This is that overall site map, and some of the things that we're going to talk about are wetlands impacted due to the construction of the embankment. 14.7 acres is our estimate. Wetland restorations, those are going to be the blue hatched areas. Wetland creation, kind of in that southeast corner, that's a green hatched. And then also beyond just total restorations and creations, you're also going to have some improved functions on wetlands that are already existing. And then again, the biomass harvest areas are technically going to meet wetland criteria, so they're also kind of part of the wetlands improvements. So I'll go into some of the details on the next few slides for each of those. So the negative impacts, kind of going back to about 2016, 2017, what we did was we took this whole site and we did a wetland inventory on it, and that's following the Corps of Engineers manual and then the Great Plains Regional Supplement. And so that's making sure that what areas meet hydrology, excuse me, soils, and vegetation. Those are the 3 criteria for wetlands. And so those maps are identified for the whole site. And then in terms of negative impacts, we're looking at the sites that, or the wetlands that have lost areas or functions. And you can see those in red. And that's basically the levee that's cutting across that southeast corner in that low area. And then also the dam embankment that's cutting through numerous wetlands. And the summation for that is the 14.7 acres. All right, go to the next slide. So after the negative impacts, we're going to talk about some of the positive impacts. First one is wetland restorations, 18 acres. And those are the blue hatched areas. And the pink kind of little line on the east side are ditch plugs. So those were partially drained or fully drained wetlands that showed up in the past due to in aerial images or in historically hydric soils. So we were able to identify just what the extents of those wetlands were before they were drained, either fully or partially. And then those are going to be restorations when we install the ditch plugs. The wetland creation in that southeast corner, 5.7 acres, and that's basically to get some extra, some fill for the embankment, and because it's right in that area near the embankment. And then it also kind of compensates for the wetland that's lost in that near area there. Beyond those areas, we have functions that are improved, and so those are wetlands that were partially drained. And we're going to also install some ditch plugs through the ditches there, and that's kind of that southernmost blue hatched area to improve on some of the functions. And functions are like habitat, some of the soils, different things that measure the kind of the pristineness of the wetland. And then the biomass harvest areas, like I said, are also going to meet the 3 criteria, so those are considered wetlands. The wetland types that we analyzed are prairie potholes, and those are in the higher landscape areas, kind of what you think of as a pothole, and then the riverine wetlands that are following this unnamed tributary of the Upper Maple River. Go to the next slide, please. We did talk about the total gain of 230 acres, and again, those that's considering the wetlands lost, the wetlands restored, created, and then the biomass harvest areas, which is significant. However, what we did want to look at, and are required to look at, beyond just the areas, are the functions. The functions are the different attributes of the wetland, and you can kind of see some of them listed here in those different pothole functions or riverine functions. But just kind of to step back, the rationale is for mitigation. So you can't remove a pristine wetland and mitigate for a poor one. So if you had a pristine 1 acre wetland, you can't just put a crummy wetland of the same acreage. You also have to mitigate for these functions, and that's what this is getting at. The scoring for this are called the hydrogeomorphic model, and again, they're separate for the potholes and riverine, just because they are different wetlands and they have different functions or attributes. To kind of identify those, we call them functional capacity units, and that's basically just the area. So example of a 1 acre area, and then by an index score, and the index scores are all these different attributes. So potholes is static storage and dynamic storage, and then cycling of nutrients, so on, all the way down to habitat. Those are the different functions that the model uses to kind of apply a value. Again, the pre-project are identified on the left, and then the post-project scores are in the middle, and then the mitigation required. If it was positive, that would be something that we would have to kind of assign or buy credits or whatever. But since these are all negative, it means that our post-project conditions are all considerably greater, especially for the potholes, than the pre-project conditions. And you can see that habitat scores less, and that's just because those biomass harvest areas don't have near the same functional scores for habitat as they do for some of the other attributes. And the same thing for riverine, not quite the highest numbers, but there's pre-project conditions and the post-projects, and that's due to the those ditch plugs in that riverine wetland, kind of in that southern southwest corner, and then the improved functions, kind of 7-ish, 8, for those different attributes. Again, they're not pristine because these still have some effects. Watershed is still manipulated some. The soils, some of them previously tilled, and again, the biomass harvest is not a pristine wetland, but it does still get some functions and scores higher in some than others. All right, we'll go to the next slide. This is just going to be a summary. We're going to develop those 240-acre shallow water biomass harvest areas, and that's predominantly for the nutrient removal. However, there are some wetland benefits to those two that I discussed with functions. 230 acres is going to be creation or restored. Again, kind of considering all those different types, restorations, creations, biomass harvest areas. And then, what I didn't kind of talk about, but just wanted to highlight too, is that there's going to be buffers around these wetlands that are managed for wildlife habitat, just depending on the proximity and the elevations of those and what types of plantings they would get. But that's considerable acreage that will be back to wildlife, more natural habitat. That is the kind of the end of my slide. I think, who do I turn it over to? I think it's to Rita.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So I'll be wrapping up the presentation with a few slides on the National Environmental Policy Act responsibilities, and I will shut off my camera as well. And so the original scoping meeting was discussed earlier was in 2016. So in that time, we did have a diverse group of stakeholders that commented on their concerns of environmental concerns. So there was about 35 total concerns, and the group decided that about 27 of those were relevant to this project. Things that aren't relevant, a lot of them are things that aren't applicable to our area, like coral reefs, or the Maple River is not considered to be a national wild or scenic river, those types of things. But many other environmental issues were considered relevant to the project. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so if we take these and we categorize them in different environmental concern areas. So I'll start with soils. We're identifying soil erosion and prime farmland as applicable soil concerns. The water resource concerns have been covered extensively by Christy and Josh and John earlier in the presentation. So those are obviously very relevant to the project, both in terms of quantity and quality and impacts to aquatic resources such as wetlands in the riparian area. The habitats, we are looking at a extensive riparian habitat in the project area. So that's important to address in the planning process. Air concerns are addressed. Plants and animals, we rely real heavily on the North Dakota Game and Fish's State Wildlife Action Plan to look for their priority areas and priority species within those areas. So we're looking at that. And then federally, the federal threatened and endangered species it's critical. We're looking at that, addressing that. Also migratory birds, undesirable species. And then also very important is in the human environment. And this is where we're looking at changes in land use, environmental justice. That would mean if we're negatively impacting one demographic, such as a low-income demographic with a project, more so than others. So that's required that we're concerned about that and we're evaluating that. Culture resources, I'll get into that in more detail about our tribal consultations. And then public health and safety, which was again addressed earlier when we were talking about the flood impacts to roads and bridges and structures and so forth, and also recreation. So you can move to the next slide, please. A land use, so predominantly the land use in the project area is cropland, but also just some riparian, hay, and pasture. There are some WRP easement land in the project area that cannot impact that area because it's covered under the easement. So the project has beneficial impacts to that easement, but doesn't directly impact it with any construction. The land NRCS's soil survey maps out the soils, and each soil has a capability class. So what we're finding in these soils in the area that most of them have a major limitation due to either wetness or shallow topsoil. We're talking about soils that are really in this, we're transitioning from the glacial lake to the prairie pothole, and we get a lot of mixing of different soils. I'm mentioning Renshaw here. That's our gravelly soil that we often get in that mixing of the interbeach area. And that is also susceptible to erosion. All right. So this map is the prime farmland report from the Web Soil Survey. The green areas indicate lands that are considered prime farmland. So a lot of that soil type is barn svea or divide loam. And you can see that there's a significant amount of prime farmland, but it is the majority of the land is in the red zones, and those are not considered prime. And that's mainly due to those things I mentioned previously, the shallow topsoil of that Renshaw Sioux soil, or the riparian is that low fluvoquent soil, which is frequently flooded. So that has limitations due to high water table and flooding. So overall, there is 122 acres of prime farmland directly impacted, either by structure or the cattail harvest area, out of the 164. But you can see that the project site in general was dominated by that red soil, which would indicate it's it's not all prime farmland, and it's a site that's acceptable as far as loss of prime farmland. Culture resources. So we consult with tribal nations and also the State Historic Preservation Officer. It's two-pronged, our work with culture resources. First of all, we have under the the National Historic Preservation Act, we must consult government to government with tribes. And so that's part of the Section 106 requirement. And also the second prong would be as part of our NEPA responsibilities, the National Environmental Preservation Act. So this process, we initiated consultation with tribes in 2018. Then they had, some of them responded that they were interested in keeping abreast of the project as it moved along. Most of them did not respond, but we keep consulting with them as we go forward. So a Class 1 literature search was completed in 2020, and that was updated in 2023. And then the survey was also done in 2020, the on-the-ground survey with the culture resource specialist, and that was recently updated as well. So we are in the process of consulting with 31 tribes. When the Class 3 survey is completed, which should be done in the next week or so, that will be sent to the tribes for their consideration and comments. And then they will also be sent the draft environmental impact statement for further comment and consultation. The results of the survey were there really, we found that our recommendation will be that the project has no effect to historic properties. The picture here is a pump house. It was considered to have no historic value. So there really, there wasn't any red flags as far as cultural resource impacts. You can go to the next slide. Okay, the species of concern. North Dakota has identified some key species within mainly the Cheyenne River focus area. Maple River is a part of that focus area. There are several species of concern. There's 2 bird species. I missed the mammal on the slide, but there's 5 mammal species, 9 species of fish, and 7 species of mussels. So when we're looking at the effects to the environment, we're considering the effects to these species, primarily since we're restoring a lot of habitat and taking some cropland and bringing it into wildlife land use. We're on the net positive as far as our impacts to habitats and species. Go to the next slide. And then federally, we're looking at federal threatened and endangered species. The one that's of greatest concern right now is this northern long-eared bat. There's serious problems that was recently upgraded from a threatened status to an endangered status. But our project has very few trees. The bat needs the trees to nest for maternity trees. And since the project has very little impact to trees, it's not anticipated this will be a problem. But we will continue to make sure we're following the policy with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Whipping crane is another species. It may be transient. So let's say there's construction and a whooping crane is observed, it would be written into the construction requirements that construction would cease while we would, to make sure we're not impacting whooping crane. Monarch butterfly, we're having a potential habitat gain. So as I said before, and generally for fish and wildlife habitat species, it's a net increase in habitat, and that's a net positive. The next slide. Yeah, so that's my summary of the environmental concerns, but our purpose today is to get your additional concerns, anything that we've forgotten, any information you want to add to what we've talked about today. You can provide these comments verbally at the meeting. Through the process here, you can email them to those email addresses, either to Christy at our state office or to the sponsor, which is Lewis C. at casscountynd.gov. You can hand deliver or mail comments to Carol at the Water Resource District. And as Christy mentioned at the beginning, this notice of intent was posted on the nationalregulations.gov site. That's another way that you can post comments. We did develop a comment form. It's on the next slide, I think. So that's there at the Cass County District, or you can find that at the Cass County Joint Water Resource District website or our website. But I'll turn it back to Josh and Pat to wrap it up and to take your questions.
Thanks, Rita. So before we get into questions and comments here today, the last thing that I'll mention is that this is part of the requirement for the planning effort. And so that is the process the Water Board is currently in the process of completing, is the watershed planning effort. Ultimately, if the project moves forward towards further engineering design or construction, is at the discretion of the Cass County Joint Water Resource District and any potential other jurisdictions that may have involvement in that area, like for instance, alternate 2A is in Barnes County, and the Barnes County Water Board has been involved through the planning process, but that would be a potentially a joint effort or something of that nature. But what we've been talking about all today is finalizing the plan. And like I said, whether or not this does move forward into further design and analysis is at the discretion of the board here moving forward. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and comments that we can take here today.
So at previous meetings, we discussed what we're gonna do with this biomass after you bale it and so forth and so on. And it seems like trying to bale that stuff and get it to the right moisture content is going to be really tough. And then what do you do with these bales after you bale it? Are you gonna try to sell it to somebody? The moisture content for baling is probably gonna have to be 20% or less so that it keeps. But maybe there's a way that we can chop that stuff up at 50 or 60 or 70% moisture and put it in a trench and let it ferment and turn it into a compost that could be spread on agricultural ground, as a fertilizer. So the use of the biomass has sort of been a problem for me all along. We're going to spend a lot of money cutting this stuff and letting it dry and baling it and handling it. If we don't have an economic use for it, that's gonna be a tough deal.
Been trying to and still working on getting some of us to go up to Manitoba in October and look at some of their bioharvesting. Supposedly they have a new machine coming in from Europe. So hopefully that'll be there when we're there. What little research I've done, in some cases, depending what the biomass is, you might be able to feed it. I know up in Manitoba, they pelletized some of it and used it for fuel, for heating. But yeah, if you just bale it off and set it somewhere close to the river, you really haven't accomplished anything. It needs to be used in some other way, and that's still some challenges. I know up in Manitoba, some of the Hutterite colonies have utilized some of that byproduct. So we continue to look for ways that are efficient and economical, because the economics in the operating plan.
The problem is to find a use for it at that location, so we don't have to truck it 100 miles or something.
The next thing is biomass areas are gonna have a dike or a berm there to hold some water, and as was noted here, how you can drive machinery up and down without destroying or hurting.
We'll have access points so machinery can get into there and harvest. So similar to a field approach where you get equipment into a field today, you have an access point where that equipment would get down into the board. Yep.
Josh, could you go back to the one slide I talked about? I think I had 3 different acreage amounts, one for use of habitat, and I think ended up with like 1,290 improved acres or something like right there. Sorry. No, we went right past that one. So explain to me now, how much land is actually going to be used in the the backfill area or the folding area? How much land is it? I can see 3 different numbers here.
You mean the dry dam, they call it? Is that what you're talking about?
Behind the dam, yeah.
Yep, the dry dam, so that's where it would
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so it's gonna be,
Can you pull up the map
yeah,
and
I'll go
show
back.
that?
Okay.
Be easier, I think, to.
I'll go back. I think this, let me go back to this one. I think it might be easier to see.
There you go.
Here you go. So this is the inundations that we talked about. So you kind of see as that project is functioning. But with the dam impound, we've assumed that basically you acquire land rights all the way up to that next section line. And if you can see my mouse on here.
I'm talking about 700 acres.
Yep.
Easement acquisition.
Pool area.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you go to the section line, that's 10 quarters.
Yeah.
So the Maple River Dam was a combination of easement and fee title right of way. What you do is you can get a legal description around the contour of what's impacted. And you may be able to just purchase a flood easement. So you pay them for the right to store water. They maintain the land and keep it and can do what they want with it as long as there's not water on it at the time. So as soon as the water's off, they retain that land. Where the embankment is generally ends up purchased. So the backwater flow is a combination of different ownership.
So that, of that 700 acres, how much is truly ag land versus wetland? Any idea?
Off the top of my head, I don't. We have that documented in our report.
I'm just curious because,
And the other thing that I'll comment on what Kurt mentioned is, so we had the same discussions with many of the landowners initially, because the intent was that it was purely a dry dam with no environmental improvements initially. And then as the planning effort developed, the environmental enhancements became a key component of the planning effort. And so with regard to the land rights portion of it, that conversation does change a little bit because of the modifications to the environmental. And so there likely will be a little bit more fee title acquisition because of the biomass harvesting areas and those types of things, where typically you'd have maybe some more easements that because it's of just flood storage. Thanks. Good question.
So the bulk of it have to be purchased in fee title. The one area that's probably the biggest exception is the WRP, that already land under easement. That's in a government contract and we can't disturb or violate that right now.
Where's that located at?
It's right, if you can see my marker, it's right here, this area.
Okay, thank you. That whole quarter is in, when did it go in? What year, do we know?
2010,
Because it's a 30-year, right?
Yep.
it might have been 2013.
Is that a,
I will say, so all that area, whether it was fee title or whether it was an easement, basically the PL 566 watershed plan will require that the land either be managed for as wildlife habitat or for biomass or for water quality improvements, or simply be a flowage easement. So each easement would potentially have restrictions depending on the watershed plan. So all of those areas that are going to be restored to wetlands that are outside of the WRP, those are essentially going to be a 50-year conservation easement on all those properties.
Even though state of North Dakota has a limit on that?
It would just be for 15 years or 50, sorry, 50
I thought you
years.
said 50 years.
50. Yeah, no, I
50
did say
years.
50 years.
But North Dakota
Yes.
state law doesn't allow that.
It doesn't allow a
No
perpetual
perpetual, you
easement.
can have a 99-year lease.
99 years.
I thought we put a 30-year limit on that for state law, sure.
It's in perpetuity.
So.
No, it can't be.
It
I
can't
thought
be
it was 30,
perpetuity.
that's why.
It's 99. As far as I'm aware, it's 99 because I
I
know
thought
that
the
the Fish
state
and
legislators
Wildlife.
put it in at 30, so they wouldn't have to worry about the perpetual. No?
I think it's longer than that.
Going back to one of the first maps that was shown
Yep.
of the big overview of things.
Yep.
Why? No, I mean, of the whole
Oh, yeah.
The whole
Okay.
watershed.
watershed,
Oh,
from
sure.
go back to the
State to old watershed.
Minnesota and North Dakota, there. Okay, why was Goose Lake allowed to be drained and come into this down here instead of, why wasn't that held back and maybe even that made into something that could be holding more water back than this?
Yes, I can't speak to whether or not drainage has occurred up in there. As
It
far
has,
as
because that's what has been the real big problem.
And a lot of what we've experienced in the Red River Valley is these closed basin sloughs that have filled and are now contributing where they previously didn't contribute before. And you see that throughout the entire Maple River watershed. Maple River Water Resource District actually owns and operates 3, I believe, high water outlet projects, 4 projects similar to that. But that's not a project that's in there that they've managed actively. But if that water is assumed, or that water is contributing to this area, and we factor that into the design.
It is.
Yep.
It has been ever since it happened, and we didn't know they had drained it until we had a real influx.
Sure.
down in our area. And then it was, oh, that might be because they drained Goose Lake.
Well, the problem was we were always called drain boards. Now we're called water resource districts. So supposedly we're gonna change.
We're evolving.
The thing with Goose Lake too, the Maple River Water Resource District did several studies of the watershed as well. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, this site was actually one of the proposed ones before the Upper Maple River Dam got built just south of Hope. Goose Lake was in I think the 2013, was there sites in there in the detention plan? Well, before that, Goose Lake was in the model. And so if this has nothing to do with Goose Lake, if Goose Lake was drained of stored water, that could be an impact downstream. But the watershed to Goose Lake is so small compared to 60 square miles coming to this site that if you just added storage at Goose Lake, the benefits would be negligible by the time you get to this site 2A or where you guys live, just because the watershed's so small. So it's not to say they didn't change something that could impact. I'm not aware of what went on there and not involved, but that's.
I do know,
One of the
talking with
factors.
people, because we moved into Page because of my husband's failing health. And so I got fairly well acquainted with people in Page, and I know there are people south of the dry dam there at Hope who said they were told that that would be an end to the road problems, and it isn't. They're still inundated by water whenever there's a water event. They can't get out of their place. They have to put their vehicle way down away and walk back and forth instead of being able to get out of their yard. So it hasn't alleviated those problems.
There was a need in that study for 3 sites. And that site 5 was originally one of those studies. But if you look at just site 5 on the economics, it's not in this plan any longer. There was 4 sites actually identified that really would need to manage that area. Upper Maple was the first one constructed, and it reduces depth and it reduces duration of flooding. But there's several other tributaries. It doesn't do anything to the water coming south of Pillsbury, coming, just south of Pillsbury and coming southeast, just because it's higher up in the watershed. So there's a need to look at projects on all the tributaries, and that's what the planning effort did, looked all over. This is the last site that survived the planning team effort.
This land was formed by the glaciation that happened. And then when Lake Agassiz was there because of all the melting of the glacier, you've got the first bench, which we call the Peak Ridge. And then it receded. And then we had a second glaciation, and that's what we call the Buffalo Ridge. So the land that you're considering is this strip of land that's about 10 miles wide. And that's where all the glaciation is because of all the dry creek beds. They're only in effect for when there's a water event. And so this land is not the best productive land, we know that, but it's our land. And we have to protect what's best for our land. And so I'm just saying that this was rejected. This proposed thing was rejected in the 90s. So why is it now viable? When it was rejected in the 90s.
I think it came back through as a planning opportunity when the retention authority was able to get USDA funding to look at watershed retention on both the Minnesota and North Dakota side. And this happened to be one of 8 in North Dakota that rose to the surface to be evaluated. You'll find with many of the flood control projects, they've had flooding since basically settlers came here. And for whatever reason, land rights, economics, drought, all of a sudden they lose steam. But the reality is they still have flooding there. And you look at Lake Township and you look at those And so it just happened to be that there was an opportunity in 2014 and 15 to get funding to reevaluate. Plus, as time goes on, there's better modeling, there's better science. And so just to do the planning itself is very time consuming, time and money and resources. And this is what that planning process has brought to light at this juncture.
So it was an agency decision, basically,
It was
as a priority.
the retention authority working with USDA and RCS, yes. It
Because
was one of 8 priorities in North Dakota.
Somebody found out that there was money available through NRC.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And then there was a planning team that guided this.
Right, yeah, and that, to go back, so when I talked at the slide, there was technical analysis that went into those alternatives that were identified, because, 2A and 5 were not the only alternatives that were looked at in terms of throughout the watershed. So there were 38 of them, and ultimately those 38 were narrowed down because of that technical analysis that was completed as part of the planning process.
I know it's not planned that there'd be a breach.
Right.
But that can always happen.
Yep. Yep.
And if there is a breach, there's a building site
Yes.
within
downstream.
short distance, which would be wiped out entirely.
Those
that the
things are addressed in your operating plan.
Yeah, and there will need to be an emergency action plan developed if this does move forward, which would then detail out a lot of that information on structures that would be impacted. We did complete a breach modeling analysis already, and that is part of our design documentation report. So that has been done based off of empirical methods and then modeling. And so we do have identified structures that could be potentially impacted.
Yeah, the state of North Dakota requires that emergency action plan for all high hazard dams. And this with the proximity of those farmsteads, because you got, Sunstroms across in your own place. Gary's, they're all right downstream. So this would be regulated to those requirements as well. And then during an event, the emergency action plan, there's requirements to daily monitor. The Maple River Dam has water in it right now, so we have to go out every day right now, monitor the site, check the roads. There's piezometers, there water pressure monitor gauges basically in the dam embankment to make sure there's not water pressure spiking in the dam. That would indicate seepage. We're checking those every day until that water goes down. So those are the types of things that go into the operation of a project like this.
Because
And
I'm
that all
sure
gets
Barb's
settled.
place would be vulnerable.
Yep.
Yeah,
An upper main.
on the upper.
Yeah.
I hope, yeah.
How about the power line for, I think it's Dakota, comes from Grand Forks down to the substation on 32. Would there be about a mile of line through this area? Would you make them move that? Or can the power line stay there and have water?
It depends upon the water level, and if we get to further design and coordination, we do have utility relocations in our planning or our cost estimates to this date. And when we get to the next phase and get to into some of those details, we'll coordinate further with them. And if we can leave them alone, that cost might come down. If we do have to relocate them, we'll have to relocate them.
Also, has Barnes County Emergency Management been involved in any of this? Because there have been times when there's been water on Highway 32, which is a state highway, and they've had to come out, law enforcement has had to come out and prevent people from driving through the water that was on the highway. So anything is going to have to be higher elevation all the way along the highway in order for the highway not to be inundated.
So the dam structure, the top of the dam is actually below the highway, the highway elevation. And so we don't have to raise the highway to accommodate the backwater pool. That is already factored in those maps. I understand it, and we've talked about this before. But to answer your question, I guess, so the Barnes County Water Board was involved in the planning effort, attended the meetings. A member of the county commission also attended a couple of
No,
meetings.
county commissioner, I talked with our district commissioner, and she said there's nothing been brought up.
Right, so
Not a thing.
not necessarily at commission meetings, but Sean Lawson was a county commissioner. He was a member of the Water Resource District when the meetings started. He became a commissioner and continued to attend meetings after he became commissioner. And Brett Fair also attended meetings on behalf of the Water Resource District. So between the water board and the county commission, they have some level of knowledge. I do not recall if Sue at the time, I don't recall Cindy, the new emergency manager, I do not recall.
Oh, no, I don't know the emergency
Oh,
manager.
Yeah, I don't remember the new emergency manager, but I do not recall if Sue was engaged in those meetings off the top of my head. Yeah, Sue Lloyd, yeah. She's now, I think, in Burley County. Yeah. But they will need to be engaged in, as through design to, again, go back to that emergency action plan. That will require the emergency management in both counties, likely involvement to develop that.
Because I know it happened Father's Day, it was either 2006, 7, or 8, something like that. It happened right in front of our driveway. And then going to Cargiss's, that intersection there coming off your old place, and then Cargiss's, that's been underwater several times. And then down by the Bush place, that's been Maxwell Place, whatever you want.
So I've got video of that from 93. I think,
Yeah.
the first time it happened.
Yeah.
Um,
And so the water then is, the highway is higher than what would be for the dam. But if the water event is enough that the water is already at a level coming onto the highway, without this dam being in, then how is that gonna help?
Right, so, and all that is factored into the modeling, and that will get even further detailed when we get the final design, if the project does move forward. But the highway, all the stuff that you're talking about is factored into our preliminary analysis that was completed.
And it's a decent time to mention to the DOT to look at their culverts. We don't have any jurisdiction over state highway culverts, but if we're gonna be talking to them anyway, it'd be worth it to say, hey, we know of this issue. The local landowners have brought this up multiple times. I've seen it multiple times. They should evaluate that crossing. And what they do with that information is up to them, but we can certainly bring that to them, suggest it.
Also on the section line that's going to your old place, they said the road would be raised up. Well, what'll that do to the box culvert that's there already? Is that gonna have to be another box culvert put on top of that?
No, so the culvert that will, that's there will maintain, flow through there. And then ultimately, at some point though, that road will overtop. So it's not intended today to be accessed all the time while the dam is in operation. But what we will do is we will raise the road up and over the embankment, excuse me, for times when it is able to be passed. And like Kurt mentioned, with regard to operations and maintenance of the other dams that the Cass County Joint Board is involved in. Again, part of that operation and maintenance and that emergency action plan is to monitor, whether or not the roads are overtopped and maintain signage and stuff to make sure people do not drive if the road is being overtopped by backwater.
That's a good clarification because it sounded like a road raise. It won't be raised for the whole mile. It'll be raised so there's a nice approach up and over the dam.
Correct.
It will go underwater during a flood, but you'd be able
They
to go
will have to
south.
find another way in and out.
Yeah,
people
but
who
they'd
live
be able
there.
to go south because that road that washes out all the time.
Then the
now
only way
it'll
would be
only
to
a
go
40
east and
inch.
over by Albert's.
They should be able to go south.
They'll be able to south.
They can go
Oh.
east or south. Because there's only, the dam is west of that section line road, and there's only gonna be a 48-inch pipe through the dam. And so we'll have to look at the downstream road hydraulics as well, make sure it can pass that. But that's one of the benefits is that road won't overtop as much anymore. I mean, there's always a larger event to say it'll never overtop. But on the big events, the 4-inch rain that happens, that road goes under, that will be protected by the dam.
That in the operating plan would be similar to the Big Maple River Dam. At a certain point, there'll be gates and warnings.
Yeah.
That'll be part of the operation plan as the water comes up.
Yeah, and then
That road
there's,
would be closed.
yep, so there's permanent gate structures that get installed. They're at the Upper Maple and they're at the Maple River Dam. And for the agency folks on the line, the naming hasn't been too creative over the years. There's actually a dam up by Hope called the Upper Maple River Dam. And we're talking about the Upper Maple River RCPP study here. So differentiating the Upper Maple River Dam, and this is Site 2A, the one we're focusing on in this meeting. The Upper Maple River Dam also has gates. North of Barb's, there's a township road that goes east-west. Those gates get closed by the township during a flood, and the Water Resource District helps maintain those. Water Resource Districts don't have authority over roads. They're just legally not a road authority. So they enter agreements with the townships to manage the gates. They'll help financial considerations. They'll help regrade the gravel after a flood event, for instance, to get the road functional again. They don't close the gate. So Piney Lake Township would have to enter an agreement with the Water Resource District if we get that far.
And one more question too. Living on the west side of Highway 32, there'll be that embankment to hold the creek from coming flooding my yard. But what about the water that comes out of, I mean, because from my yard is here and it slopes down to the creek. So that's the way the water's going. So if this is held up this high, this water is just gonna stay in my yard anyway. How is that gonna be? Can I pump it out?
Yeah, so we're ultimately at this point, so the point of the farmstead levy is to match protections. So that way, if the dam does overtop, it will not overtop back in it. So again, it's much higher. So there's actually freeboard included in that levy height for the proposed farm levy there. So more often than not is the water will be able to gravity drain through there with a gate, a closure structure to allow to open and close. That would allow water to pass as it currently does from your farm site into that creek. And you would really only see impacts once the emergency spillway was overtopped by multiple feet. And then it gets to, close to that top of dam, because you've only got 3 feet of that max height is about 3 feet. And so of that levee on that property. So you will have gravity drainage that will continue to be available until that dam is overtopping. So a catastrophic type event.
On the one map, it showed that it doesn't go that far,
Right, yeah.
but this shows it goes further past beyond the building site. And
So right, so on this map here, this is the actual footprint. When these other 2 maps, and I'll go back here, when these 2 maps were developed, it was really early on. And so we had put the lines on paper basically saying, we recognize that we need a levee to help protect that farmstead if the dam does get to the point where it's overtopping or flowing over the emergency spillway at a significant depth. So these were early on. And then when we got to the actual design, we got, used LiDAR and built out surfaces. This is the actual footprint of that. It's much smaller than what those original maps show.
so the berm is going to be going along there. And the proposed berm, I'm saying.
Yep.
And through our lane, which is right south of the barn before the pasture. It's in the lane going to the pasture and out into that field. Is that what it is? In order
Right,
to
so-
keep up with the elevation?
Yep, yeah, so we'll basically tie in and then grade back until that elevation daylights into the field. And if we have to modify access or something like that, we definitely will work with you on that.
And how about how much of the pasture is going to be under that too?
As far as inundation underwater, so I'll go back to this other map here. There you go. So on the 100-year, when you're looking at this map, that's the purple. So on the 100-year, it's just a creek that is inundated. That's already naturally there. Again, so as you get to those larger, and when we designed the dams, we designed as something much bigger than the 100-year 24-hour. And so that levee that I mentioned has freeboard associated with it to help protect in those much larger scenarios.
Because
So-
we've already had.
Right, yeah, you already have.
Back further than that's showing right now.
Yep, and that's
Yeah.
due to potentially the culverts that you mentioned.
Yeah, when it comes up to the top of the highway, the water will actually flow north over my driveway and will keep going
going
north.
north,
The highway
yeah.
ditch, it's the opposite way, but it gets up so high, it'll flow the wrong way. And then it comes back that mile or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's a function of the culvert size.
Culvert sizing, yep.
And that's a state culvert.
Yep, right, exactly. And then we had talked about that, I think, at a previous meeting, that if we get to the design piece, we still will need to engage with the DOT. And again, the water board isn't necessarily, they don't manage roads. And that is a state highway, but the water board can work with those agencies and has worked with those agencies to install culverts in the past, if they're necessary. So that, and we have noted those same comments from the last time that we had discussed with the road overtopping the culvert size.
I know talking with Brad McKay, he's very concerned about the water quality because they have a private well and it's a shallow well. Ring dike is not exciting to him either,
Yeah,
but the water quality for his family is the big thing for him.
So have you guys actually been out there and did an actual survey, or are you just going off maps?
No, there's been a lot of work that's gone into this. And so there was physical survey that was completed to help with the design. There's mapping, there's LiDAR. We used all the tools that we had available to us to help put together the modeling, and then ultimately the preliminary design, what you see in front of you that was shown today. And then including, the cultural resources that was done. Those sites were all walked back in 2020, and then some of them again with some of the newly impacted areas of biomass harvesting areas again in 2023.
Has anybody ever mentioned anything about something called the McClellan Trail?
Not that I recall.
Because we've been told that the wagon roads in our pasture on section 27 were part of what was called the McClellan Trail, and it's a historic trail. I was just wondering if any of that has been looked into.
I believe, I can speak to that.
Rita's gonna talk. Rita, yeah.
Yeah, I believe that the cultural resource specialist, when we were just out last week, she mentioned trailheads, and that's something that was on her radar as far as potential cultural resources. So yeah, that will, I'll take a look at that class 3 report, and we can get back to you on that. But yeah, it is all those, they do a search at the State Historic Preservation Office, and they have to address all those issues. So there was a trail there that will most certainly be discovered and noted and avoided, or in the process.
What if the state SHPO doesn't have it in their inventory?
Well, we would welcome any, additional information that private landowners would have. Is there a landowner that has knowledge that we should be speaking with, or yourself, or?
The only one I know is, because most of the people who are aware of these things have passed on.
Right.
But we have wagon roads in that pasture on section 27. And that's what it was. It was because it's a low point for the creek, and they could pass through there because the Tower City was a land office, and that's where the land agents would also use that trail then going back and forth to bring prospective homesteaders out to see different sites.
Can you show me on a map after we're done, and I'll note that, and then I can provide that to you, Rita.
That would be good. Yep. Yeah, this is exactly why we're meeting. We need to get additional scoping information. So thank you.
Also, I was wondering, where is all the material coming from for making the dam site?
Yeah, so all of the material for creating the dam is actually coming from the site itself through excavation and I can go back to those slides here briefly to show you. So So this is the secondary spillway, which is the tan area on the map. So that's all excavation. And so the material that's excavated from that secondary spillway will also be utilized to build a dam embankment in addition to leveling off and excavation of the biomass harvesting areas. We'll have the creek berms, and there's going to be some excavation and embankment that's associated with that. But all of the material to construct the dam and the farmstead levees and those features are coming from the site.
And there was a significant amount of soil borings taken there to make sure it was adequate clay, because not every place has clay.
Right.
There's
Yeah, we know.
a lot of rock piles out there, so.
Rock piles and sand.
But you won't see, 1,000 semis coming down the road today bringing in clay from 10 miles away. It appears that clay will be able to be generated on site. And then what typically happens, the contractor will bring in off-road trucks. We have no idea, but usually they bring in off-road haulers and figure out their site that way.
Would it be possible for Cass County Joint Water Board members, Barnes County Water Board members, commissioners from both counties, and the landowners to meet on site and see this place? Because it might look fairly decent. The best site that you've said, this rises to the top each time you've looked at it, but it's really flat. There's a lot of flatness there. And I don't see that that is really a good reservoir when there's so much flatness. It would be good if everybody could come out and see it. And then landowners, I'm not going to speak for other landowners, but if there are other landowners who have concerns, it would be good for them to be able to voice it at that time in an informal type outdoor gathering.
I guess I can't speak to, the board definitely could do that if they wanted to as a separate meeting, but I can't speak to. Yeah, it's because some board members have been out there.
I've been there several times,
So-
yes.
There's a lot of steps between now and construction too that would be required. There's multiple public, if it gets, this is the plan gets published, then you get to detailed design. By the time you get to detailed design, then it's time to pull the final trigger on if it's going to get built or not. To do that, there's land acquisition, there's agreements between counties, there's agreements with townships, there's public hearings, at least 2 required by law. Water boards have been doing a 3rd public meeting ahead of that. And that's in addition to any of the other landowner meetings that have already been held. So there's a lot of steps.
I know you said this has been a long process since 2016. But this letter I got was the only letter I've ever gotten. And I wouldn't have been at the Page meeting unless I heard somebody saying this was going to be a meeting about this. At the Page meeting, that was, what, 21?
2019,
And
and there was one in 2020 also.
2021 too.
yeah, that was 21 must have been the one that I was at, and I overheard somebody saying something about it in Page. That's the only reason I knew there was something. So I think other landowners have not been aware either.
Yeah, well, and you got this last.
I got a letter, yes.
All the landowners got the same letter.
So at what stage will we go for having an assessment vote?
That would be after the final design phase.
After.
Yep. And then you go through an assessment vote for the benefiting parties and or the impacted parties, where right away the land acquisition would be necessary from.
What does that mean?
So what Keith is talking about is the assessment process, which is the process by which the water board has to go through to construct and maintain a facility that they own and operate. ultimately, what that local assessment district will do is fund the local share, which with this planning effort is reduced quite a bit because this does provide access to additional funding federally. And you also have state funding through the Water Commission, local funding through the Cass County Flood Sales Tax, potentially, and then also whatever is left over after all of those buckets of funding, there would need to be River Joint Board as well. After all of those buckets, there would be a local fund necessary to build, construct a project, and then to operate and maintain it into the future. So the benefiting parties that receive benefit from the project, and the board will have to do a determination of benefits to determine who those people are. Those properties will get an assessment vote. In addition to that, all of the people that are impacted by the project in terms of land rights will also get a vote based off the acreages and property values for those properties. And ultimately, that process works out where as long as a simple majority of the votes that are returned are for the project, and the project will move forward. And so 50.01% of the return votes. If those are returned in favor, then the project will move forward. If those are, if they're no, if they vote no, 50.01%, then the project will stop for the time being, but it may come back in the future if there is a desire to move the project forward or potentially modify something. And so that process is much further down the road, where everybody that benefits from it will get a vote on whether or not the project does move forward.
Okay, shouldn't that also include the ones who are being asked?
It will, yep. So anybody that's required, that land rights will be purchased from for the project, so yourselves, that then you will also get a vote in that as well. It's called a right-of-way ballot or a protest ballot. And so you will have the opportunity to vote your share based off, again, acreage and taxable value of that piece of property that's being acquired. And there's a methodology that goes into that. But yes, it's not just benefiting parties, it's people that may have land acquired from them as part of the project as well.
So you're planning on that berm on ours is going to be part of the project, so you
will get a vote, yes.
You're buying that property.
Yeah, we talked about that briefly before, then yes, that portion of the project where a berm is being built would likely need to be owned and be titled by the board for access and maintenance long term.
I did not know that.
And then ultimately, in addition to that, we talked about the inundated areas, the flooding areas, and that flowage easement would likely also need to be acquired on your property as well.
So as far as special assessments, what criteria is used to determine benefit? And how far down the stream does it go? How many miles down that way? How many miles off to the side?
So I guess I won't speak for the board because there's a number of things that'll go into that determination of benefits. And I'll give you some examples. It could be direct benefit from water, the water surface elevation on your property being inundated during normal conditions and now is no longer inundated or much reduced. That's potentially a direct benefit, but there could also be indirect benefits to townships due to access of roadways and roadways no longer being impacted to the extent that they are today. Counties are the same way. So there's a number of different things that would go into that, and those would be part of that determination of benefits, which again is down the road. But it could be, like I said, reduce inundation due to the dam being in place downstream. And so how far downstream they go, it might go all the way downstream to drain 46. It would be, they'd have to look at.
So how many miles would that be?
Oh, that's I think 20 river miles plus or minus, 30 river miles plus or minus downstream. And it could be an indirect assessment to the other facilities that may benefit, like drain 46.
Yeah, well, you'd have to map.
And there's a lengthy legal process that the board will have to go through to do that determination of benefits, and we're not even close to doing that. So everything that I'm telling you is factors that could go into it, but it's just hypothetical, and the board will do that process when the time comes. And
Yeah, I think it's important to note that impact properties, either the board would either purchase the property or purchase the easement on the property. There's compensation to the property owners just for that piece. It's not just to come in and take it. It'll be a fair compensation for either an easement or the acquisition of that property.
Is that based on if it's cropland or prime farmland or, I'm just asking.
It's based on a lot of different things I found out. Yeah, those are two parts, yes. Yes, those are definitely two parts of it.
There's, yeah, that'll all be, those are legally required hearings to talk about the assessment district and present all this information. So far, the Cass County Joint Water Resource District has not assessed, like, tax assessment district upstream of the embankment, just downstream. We'll look at it all. There'll be meetings to
As an
discuss.
example, how far does the Maple River Dam Assessment District go to the northeast?
So the Maple River Dam goes all the way
Past
from,
Mapleton, doesn't it?
yeah, it goes all the way to the Cheyenne River, to where the Maple enters the Cheyenne River, and that gets into
Is this the one from Enderlin?
Enderlin's Dam. Yep, the big,
It goes all the way to the Cheyenne River.
and that one is related to a substantial reduction in breakout flooding north of West Fargo, from West Fargo up to Harwood. So from Mapleton all the way through Harwood, that dam reduces peak flows quite substantially and reduces the duration of flooding. And so that assessment district, there's benefits all the way to the Cheyenne River.
So who manages these assessment districts? I mean, is that separate from?
County auditor takes care of the list.
The Water Resource District is the one that develops that list based off of a lot of the criteria that we talked about in terms of benefits. Once that list is developed, the water board helps maintain those in terms of parcel splits and those types of things. And then the water board themselves are the ones that evaluate on an annual basis whether or not maintenance needs to be collected based off of road repairs. And so they do that on an annual basis. And then they will determine whatever levy is necessary. And there's a maximum. It might be 25 cents here, some here it might be $1, depending upon what's required to maintain that facility. And then they provide that then to the auditor to collect those assessments.
Good. I'd like to circle back to, if we could, NRCS and the consultants to the water board, invite those landowners that are impacted by the secondary spillway and the structure to maybe meet on site to help them envision. And some people are good at that, and other people are not. And I just, you know, the meeting might be a bust for some individuals, and for others, the light bulb will come on and they'll say, now I see what you're saying about the amount of soil that will be taken from here to build the structure so high. But if you think that would help you and those impacted landowners, it makes sense to sometime this summer, just take a part of it a day, get NRCS there as well as you folks, and
And
because
not when it's planting or harvest time.
Yeah.
no,
Just when we're watching things grow.
Yeah.
ideally, you know, or do it late after the harvest, but
Well, that's winter.
yeah, I know, it's.
I don't
it's
know
kinda
how you're
like
gonna do that,
spring in
but
North Dakota,
we
it
don't
can be
even know
4
what
days
harvest
long,
is.
but
Doctor's appointment's already.
Yep,
up.
and
Good
it-
to see you all. Thank you.
thank you, Kurt. So I would recommend that, Josh, that sit down with Christie or Rita and, you know, it's probably only gonna be a handful of landowners. I think we should do that.
And you know, in addition, you could put a rod up that shows the top of a dike or something, so that people have some idea of what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
And you could do it in half a dozen places so that
Especially if there's
you know where this is
telephone
going.
or rural electric
Yeah,
poles.
paint a line on it or something.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
Good.
Yeah, I think more communication is better than less.
Yeah, like I said, this is the first notification I've had that there was anything. And if it's been since 2016, that's 7 years that this has been proceeding. And I did know about the meeting in Page, but that was by accident. So I think it would be good to have more communication if you're wanting cooperation.
Darren, you and I also talked when we got permission from you to walk on your property and evaluate the cultural resources back in 2020. We talked a couple times, because the archaeologist, I was actually on site with him. I'm an archaeologist. I was an innocent bystander.
In 2020, we were living in Page at the time. I wouldn't have been out at the farm.
No, no one was there, but we had asked for permission, otherwise we wouldn't have went there. I mean, we talked to every landowner during that time period.
Yep, and then after that,
You
so,
must have, like I said, my husband passed away and he had Parkinson's and cancer.
And you should have gotten letters to the other two public meetings in 2019 and 2020.
and
No, I never did.
We did attend the,
We did attend the one in Page, but it was because I overheard somebody else saying it was gonna be.
Yeah, there was two meetings in Page that you came, one Page and one other one that we had.
ultimately, in the, so after the cultural work that Pat had referenced, the landowners were invited back to Page, and that because of the changes in the environmental portion of the plan like we had talked about. And so we're at that meeting, but ultimately, and at that meeting concluded with, we'll provide updates as the planning effort gets towards finalizing, and this is that next step. So there really had, between that meeting that you were at in Page at that time and today, what's really happened is updates to the documents in coordination with the NRCS and ultimately, as Christy noted early on in the meeting, that this changed from an EA to an EIS. Those are things that we've been working on internally, and then again, providing updates as things have changed, which this meeting was a change from what had happened previously. So, but the board will continue to keep you guys updated as meetings progress into the future, if they progress. But, you know, but yes, and so meeting with everybody on site, we'll work with the board and other landowners as well to try to figure out a date that works best for everybody at some point this summer. And then ultimately try to get some markings out there so that you can identify the features, because it may be a little bit difficult to visualize them. But we'll continue to do that, or we'll plan to do that, and then we'll be in touch with you guys as landowners as that happens.
And then probably come up with a rain date too, whether it's not. And there's three of us here, three of us agree. I think we should do it. I think it's worthwhile.
Absolutely.
Pat, I'm sorry if I don't remember that, giving you permission. I'm sorry. Like I said, with my husband's health issues, I might have put everything else off a little bit too. I don't know.
Well, that's fine. It's just that we've been notifying landowners for 7 years, so.
The one thing, the board doesn't operate in a vacuum, and that's the point, is the board wants to be communicative, because if the project gets sprung on someone, it's a surprise, things tend to not go well in that scenario. So the board will continue to keep you guys involved as the process moves forward.
One last question, Josh. Timeline, what's the current timeline? What are the next steps just for these individuals and for us? Where are we at with timing?
Yeah, so the comment, Christy or Rita, correct me if I'm wrong, but comments are due back within 60 days. So I believe July. And at some point here after July, we'll end up finalizing that planning document here, hopefully this fall, is the tentative schedule.
Yeah, Josh, I guess, just to be clear, we sent the notice to the Federal Register in March, and they insisted that I set a meeting date at that time. And so we did. And the Federal Register notice has actually not even posted. So it'll be 60 days from whenever the notice posts, which hopefully will be soon. So it'll really be a little bit longer than 60 days. And after we receive comments back, that basically guides us in finalizing the document of the EIS. But we have two different reviews within NRCS. We first have to go to the National Water Management Center to get comments, and we get those comments back. And then more in NRCS between the two of us are going to have to address the comments in the EIS document. And then we send it to our headquarters for a second review. And again, we'll get comments back and we'll have to address those. And really the number of comments will drive how long it takes both more and NRCS to address them. So we have to get through all of that, and then we release the draft EIS to the public for comments. So just based on past experience, I would guess October, November would be about the time period. We would be ready to release the draft for comments. And at that point, we'll have an in-person meeting. We'll do another presentation and get additional comments. And after that, there's actually several steps in the EIS process that kind of showed on the other screen. So, I mean, at the earliest, I would expect this plan to be authorized would be late winter of 2023-4.
Okay, so Christie, do we have to resubmit our questions and answers or concerns? Or the ones we
Nope.
had now at this meeting will be applying to that?
Yeah, so the verbal comments that you made will be written up and they'll be in the document, and Appendix A is where we put all comments from agencies and the public. So yeah, the meetings today will be transcribed, and then you can submit any additional ones as well.
Thank you.
If you guys would add your address and phone number on the back of that sheet, it's easier on the back than on the front.
I guess, Christie, this is Keith. That's one thing I remember from planning is if there's official comments, they actually become part of the watershed plan. They're an addendum or an appendices. And so if you make a comment, it will be acknowledged in the plan.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments from anybody online?
Just money.
Any other comments in the room, questions?
Thank you for setting this meeting up. Appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for allowing us to.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks everybody for your
It's
attendance.
important for us to hear your voice.
It's a good meeting.
Thanks for allowing us to be here then.
So Pat, are you the boss then, or what?
His
You
wife,
sound like the boss.
his wife is the
Can you
boss.
stop the recording, please, and we'll end the meeting?
Aaron, you
I got.
He's gonna walk around all day with his